something building up inside of me for all I don't know.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Hollywood Remembers video. Today, we're honoring the American stars we've recently lost, along with other beloved figures who have touched our lives around the world. Before we dive in, if this video resonates with you, we'd truly appreciate a like. It helps us continue sharing these heartfelt tributes with the respect and care they deserve. Thank you for your support. And now, let's begin. Today, we pause to honor the life and legacy of Camilla Carr, an actress and author whose career was shaped not by noise, but by quiet confidence and grace. She belonged to a generation of performers who understood that presence mattered more than spectacle, and that sincerity could leave a deeper mark than excess. On screen, Camilla brought a calm intelligence to her roles. Whether in film or television, her performances were grounded, thoughtful, and human. She had a way of standing still and letting emotions speak through small gestures, measured words, and an unmistakable sense of authenticity. For many viewers, especially those who grew up with her work, she represented a kind of storytelling that trusted the audience to feel rather than be told what to feel. Beyond acting, she was also a writer, someone drawn to reflection and expression in quieter forms. That balance between creativity and restraint defined much of who she was. Colleagues remembered her as composed and kind, and audiences sensed that same integrity in her work. Camilla Carr's contribution may not have chased headlines, but it offered something lasting: dignity, warmth, and a steady presence that still resonates. Her work remains a reminder of a time when stories unfolded patiently and characters breathed naturally. If her performances meant something to you, take a moment to reflect and share your memories in the comments. Your remembrance helps keep these meaningful legacies alive, gently and respectfully, where they belong. Chuck's voice was unmistakable, powerful yet vulnerable, capable of tenderness without losing strength. When he sang, it felt personal, as if the music was reaching out rather than performing for attention. His performances gave listeners permission to feel joy, longing, and reflection all at once, and that balance became a defining part of his musical identity. Behind the music was a man shaped by experience, resilience, and hard-earned self-awareness. His journey was not without struggle, and that truth quietly lived inside his vocals. It is one reason his songs continue to resonate with listeners who understand that life is rarely simple, but always meaningful when faced with honesty. For many, Chuc Negron's work is inseparable from memories of youth, long drives, living rooms filled with music, and moments when a song said what words could not. His contributions were never about excess, but about connection, between melody and emotion, between artist and audience. As we reflect on his legacy, we recognize a voice that offered comfort, strength, and sincerity across decades. If his music walked with you through any chapter of your life, feel free to share your memories and reflections. Remembering together is a quiet way of honoring what truly mattered. Ebo Taylor's work was defined by patience and clarity. His arrangements were thoughtful, his guitar lines precise yet warm, and his melodies guided by a deep respect for rhythm and heritage. Rather than chasing trends, he allowed music to unfold naturally, giving space to groove, conversation, and collective feeling. Listening to his songs often felt like being invited into a shared memory rather than a performance. He was also a teacher in the truest sense. Through decades of work, he influenced generations of musicians who saw in him a model of discipline, humility, and artistic integrity. His presence carried calm authority, the kind earned through experience rather than assertion. audiences sensed that his music came from a place of lived knowledge and quiet confidence. For many listeners, especially those who value music as something to live with rather than rush through, Ebo Taylor's recordings remain companions. They evoke evenings, reflections, and moments when sound connects people beyond language or geography. As we honor Ebo Taylor, we recognize a life devoted to balance, craft, and cultural continuity. If his music ever accompanied a moment in your life, you're welcome to share that memory in the comments. Keeping these stories alive is a gentle way to honor a legacy built on listening, respect, and time.
Lorie Morgan is more than a country music star. She is a story about survival disguised as melody. This is not a story about chart positions, record sales, or even awards. It is a story about what happens when a child grows up learning that love can disappear overnight, and music becomes the only place where grief can safely live. Lorie Morgan's life cannot be understood through fame alone. Fame arrived later. Pain arrived first. Her journey is not about success. It is about becoming. She was born into a house where music wasn't an aspiration. It was oxygen. Her father, George Morgan, was already a respected voice in country music, a man whose presence commanded rooms and whose talent set expectations before Lorie ever had the chance to form her own identity. He represented discipline, legacy, and pressure, not cruelty, but gravity, the kind that bends everything around it. Her mother, by contrast, offered emotional warmth. Where her father embodied performance and professionalism, her mother represented safety. Lorie grew up suspended between these two forces, the weight of excellence on one side and the quiet need to feel protected on the other. That tension would shape her entire emotional vocabulary. Then, when Lorie was still very young, the axis of her world collapsed. George Morgan died suddenly when she was just 13 years old. There was no slow goodbye, no gradual preparation. One day, the pillar was there. The next, it was gone. For a child raised in the shadow of a powerful figure, that loss didn't just create sadness, it created confusion about stability, about identity, about how quickly everything could vanish. From that moment forward, Lorie learned a lesson she would carry for decades. Nothing is permanent, not even love, not even applause. Music became more than expression. It became defense. She discovered early that singing could do something words could not. It could soften rooms. It could pause conflict. It could bring approval, if only briefly. When she sang, adults listened. When she sang, people smiled. When she sang, silence felt safer. Talent, in her case, was not a gift wrapped in joy. It was a shield. Lorie didn't step into music with dreams of stardom. She stepped into it with instinct. The instinct of someone trying to survive emotional instability by becoming necessary. If she could sing, she could belong. If she could perform, she could matter. Her early years were marked by movement and uncertainty. With her father gone, life no longer felt anchored. The industry that once promised continuity now felt indifferent. Legacy did not guarantee protection. The last name opened doors, but it did not keep them open. And yet, she kept singing. There is something quietly powerful about that persistence, not the loud kind, the kind that happens privately, long before anyone is watching. Lorie learned her craft in spaces that weren't glamorous, clubs, late nights, small stages where applause was inconsistent and rejection was frequent. Success did not rush toward her. It circled, tested her endurance. What most people don't realize is that by the time Lorie Morgan reached mainstream attention, she had already lived through several emotional lives: loss, reinvention, disappointment, hope. The voice people would later call timeless had already been shaped by grief and adaptation. She wasn't chasing fame, she was chasing stability. And when success finally did arrive, it would come fast, almost violently, before revealing how fragile momentum can be without emotional foundation. But that comes later. For now, what matters is this: Lorie Morgan's story begins not with applause, but with absence. Not with triumph, but with a young girl learning that survival sometimes means learning how to sing through pain without letting the world hear the cracks. This is not a story about being famous. It is a story about learning how to stay standing when the ground keeps disappearing. By the time Lorie entered her 20s, she already understood something most people only learn later in life. Momentum can feel like security, but it isn't the same thing. For years, her progress had been slow and uneven. She sang backup. She waited. She learned how to survive inside a system that admired her voice, but did not yet know what to do with her. Being George Morgan's daughter opened conversations, but it also created a quiet skepticism. People listened with crossed arms, waiting to see if the legacy was earned or borrowed. That uncertainty hardened her. Then suddenly, everything changed. When her solo career finally broke through in the late 1980s, it did not creep forward. It surged. Hits arrived quickly. Radio embraced her voice. Audiences responded not only to the purity of her tone, but to something deeper embedded within it. An emotional transparency that didn't sound rehearsed. Her voice carried pain without explaining it, strength without boasting. Songs like Dear Me and 5 Minutes resonated because they didn't feel performative. They felt lived in. Lorie sang as someone who knew what it meant to lose something irreplaceable and still show up the next day. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving inside music. She was winning. Awards followed. Chart toppers accumulated. Her name became a constant presence on country radio. In an industry that often moves on quickly, she suddenly felt undeniable. For someone who had grown up fearing instability, success felt like proof that the ground had finally stopped shifting. But here's the truth that often hides behind fast ascensions. When success comes quickly, it doesn't give you time to build internal structure. Lorie's rise was professional, but emotionally, she was still assembling herself. Fame amplified everything she hadn't yet resolved. The need to be needed, the fear of abandonment, the belief that love, like applause, could vanish at any moment. She became visible before she became anchored. Behind the scenes, her personal life was already showing fractures. Relationships formed intensely and dissolved painfully. Marriage did not bring the sense of safety she hoped for. Instead, it mirrored the pattern she had known since childhood. Closeness followed by loss. She didn't collapse publicly. There was no scandal, no tabloid catastrophe. What unfolded was quieter and far more common. Financial decisions made under pressure. Trust placed in the wrong hands. A belief that momentum would always last. It didn't. The success that had arrived so decisively began to strain her rather than support her. Touring schedules exhausted her. Emotional expectations multiplied. The industry celebrated her strength, but rarely asked whether she was okay. At one point, despite chart success and public recognition, Lorie found herself financially vulnerable. Not ruined, but exposed. The paradox was sharp. She was more famous than ever, yet increasingly unsure of her footing. The success came fast, but the structure was not ready. This is where many stories choose drama. They look for villains or external blame. But Lorie's situation resists that framing. What happened wasn't betrayal, it was imbalance. Fame asked more from her than she had been taught to protect, and yet she didn't disappear. Instead, something subtle but crucial occurred. Rather than clinging desperately to the version of success she already had, Lorie began to adapt. She leaned into work, not as escape, but as recalibration. She accepted that the path forward might not look like the path behind her. The most important shift was not professional, it was psychological. She began to understand that survival through talent had limits, that singing could open doors, but it could not heal everything. That approval could feel stabilizing but could never replace internal security. The industry noticed her resilience before she named it herself. What followed wasn't a comeback story, because she had never truly left. It was something more mature, a redirection, a chance to redefine where she belonged and how she wanted to be seen. Television would become that space, not as a downgrade, as a second chance. What television offered Lorie Morgan was not rescue. It offered belonging. After the turbulence of rapid success and the quiet instability that followed, the shift toward television felt almost counterintuitive. To some, it looked like a step sideways. To Lorie, It felt like something rarer, a space where she could exist without constantly proving herself. Stage lights are unforgiving. Every performance is a test. Television, by contrast, allowed rhythm, continuity, a sense of place. As she became a regular presence on Grand Ole Opry broadcasts and country television programming, something changed in how audiences perceived her. She was no longer just a hitmaker passing through the spotlight. She became familiar, trusted, part of the fabric. That familiarity mattered more than numbers ever had. For someone whose life had been defined by absence of a father, of emotional certainty, consistency became its own form of healing. Showing up regularly, being expected, knowing where she belonged. This was not reinvention driven by desperation. It was realignment driven by self-awareness. Behind the camera, Lorie was still carrying personal grief. Relationships continued to test her. Love still felt precarious. But she was beginning to understand that stability did not have to come from perfection. It could come from repetition, from acceptance, from being present rather than exceptional. And her artistry changed because of it. Her voice remained powerful, but it softened in new ways. Instead of projecting resilience, she allowed vulnerability to surface, subtly, without announcement. She sang less like someone fighting to be heard, and more like someone who had nothing left to prove. Audiences noticed. They didn't call it evolution. They called it honesty. But even as she found steadier footing, another shift was approaching, one that would redefine her legacy beyond hits or visibility. The country music industry itself was changing. The 1990s brought younger voices, sharper branding, and a more commercial tone. For artists like Lorie, this created a quiet fork in the road. Adapt outwardly, or deepen inwardly. She chose the second. Rather than chasing trends, she leaned into emotional truth. Songs became less about radio formulas and more about lived experience. Love was no longer idealized. Loss was no longer softened. She sang about disappointment without theatrics, about endurance without slogans. This artistic pivot wasn't dramatic. There was no press release, no declaration. It happened slowly, album by album, performance by performance, and that slowness was the point. At the same time, her inner life demanded attention she could no longer postpone. Years of unresolved grief, fear of abandonment, and emotional overextension had accumulated quietly. Success had masked it, momentum had postponed it, but now there was space to confront it. She did not frame this period as crisis. She framed it as responsibility. Responsibility to herself, to understand why love felt unstable, why validation felt necessary, why she carried such pressure to be enough for everyone else. This introspective turn did not make headlines, but it changed everything, because what followed was not another professional peak, but an artistic transformation that would surprise even long-time listeners. She began choosing roles, songs, and collaborations that asked more emotionally than they promised commercially. She gravitated toward material that explored regret, forgiveness, and accountability. The voice that once shielded pain was now willing to reveal it, and in doing so, she became something more enduring than a star. She became credible, not because she never faltered, but because she let the audience see that faltering did not disqualify her. The chapter of reinvention was nearing its end. What came next would test her not privately, but publicly, in a way no amount of preparation could prevent. By the time Lorie Morgan entered the later phase of her career, the external chaos had quieted, but the internal conflict had sharpened. This is the part of the story that rarely gets framed honestly. Not because it is scandalous, but because it is uncomfortable. It doesn't fit neatly into narratives of triumph or tragedy. It exists in the gray area where many adults live, but few publicly acknowledge. Lorie was successful, respected, established, and yet something remained unresolved. The pressure to please, to be agreeable, gracious, strong, had followed her since childhood. As the daughter of a legend, as a woman in a male-dominated industry, as a performer whose voice carried emotional weight, she learned early that being valued often meant being accommodating. That instinct didn't disappear with maturity. It refined itself. Perfection became subtle. Not about looks or performance, but about emotional composure. About not disappointing. about being fine even when things were not. And the cost of that pattern is rarely visible until it becomes unavoidable. Privately, her personal life continued to fracture in ways that echoed earlier losses. Marriages ended, trust eroded. The repetition itself became a source of self-questioning, not anger, reflection. Why did stability remain elusive? Why did love feel conditional? These questions did not lead her outward. They pulled her inward. There was no public breakdown, no dramatic turning point framed for consumption. Instead, there was silence, a recalibration that did not ask for witnesses. At one moment, known to everyone yet rarely spoken aloud, everything collided. A single public incident on a global stage condensed years of emotional pressure into seconds. It does not need to be described. Everyone already knows what it represents. What matters is what followed. The absence of noise. Instead of explanation, there was distance. Instead of defensiveness, there was introspection. Lorie did not rush to reframe herself publicly or demand understanding. She chose something far more difficult: restraint. This period marked a decisive shift in how she related to identity itself, no longer as performer first, but as participant in her own life. She began prioritizing internal alignment over public perception. Therapy, reflection, and emotional accountability became tools, not admissions of weakness. This wasn't withdrawal, it was maturation. The industry often rewards resilience framed as invulnerability. Lorie's response challenged that expectation. She did not perform healing, she practiced it. Her artistry reflected this change almost immediately. Performances became quieter, more deliberate. Songs carried pauses that once would have been filled with intensity. Silence became part of the expression. She wasn't trying to convince anyone of anything anymore. And that is often when credibility deepens. What emerged was not a corrected image, but a reframed one. Lorie Morgan was no longer presenting herself as an icon or a survivor or a cautionary tale. She was presenting herself as a woman still learning, still accountable, still imperfect. That honesty created distance from spectacle and closeness with audiences who recognized themselves in the struggle. There is a particular courage in refusing to weaponize pain for relevance, in allowing complexity without explanation, in trusting that silence can sometimes communicate more than words. This chapter of her life did not restore anything that had been lost. It redefined what mattered. And with that redefinition came the final transformation, not toward reinvention, but toward legacy. Legacy is often misunderstood. It is not a list of accomplishments. It is not a highlight reel. And for Lorie Morgan, it was never meant to be loud. Her legacy emerged slowly, almost quietly, after the intensity of becoming someone else had finally given way to becoming herself. By the time she reached this stage of her life, the idea of reinvention no longer appealed to her. Reinvention implies replacement, as if earlier versions were mistakes. Lorie did not see her past that way. Every phase, success, instability, grief, silence, had contributed something essential. What changed was her relationship with expectation. She stopped measuring worth by relevance. She stopped chasing proximity to attention. Instead, she leaned into roles that asked for presence rather than performance. Mother, artist, witness, student of her own patterns. Her music reflected this shift with remarkable clarity. The voice remained unmistakable, but it carried less urgency, less pleading. Where earlier songs reached outward, these later performances turned inward. They did not ask to be chosen. They existed. In a culture that rewards constant visibility, that restraint became radical. Audiences who followed her for decades noticed something profound. Lorie Morgan no longer needed to convince anyone that she belonged. She had internalized belonging. That confidence was not loud, it was grounded. Her legacy, then, is not defined by how many times she topped the charts, though she did, nor by the eras she dominated, though she shaped them. It is defined by endurance without spectacle. She showed that talent can begin as a defense and mature into a form of truth. That vulnerability does not cancel strength, it refines it. That growth does not always move upward. Sometimes it moves inward. Most importantly, she modeled something rare in public life: the courage to remain unfinished. She did not present herself as healed. She did not package wisdom into slogans. She allowed evolution to be ongoing, visible and unresolved. That honesty resonates far beyond music, because at its core, Lorie Morgan's story is not about country music. It is about becoming whole without becoming hardened, about learning that value does not disappear when applause fades, about choosing integrity over performance. The greatest role she ever played was not on stage. It was learning how to live without needing to be saved by success.